Hello, my name is Katharine Owens, and I'm professor and chair of the Department of Politics, Economics, and International Studies at the University of Hartford in Connecticut in the United States. And I'm here to talk about my project, Entangled and Ingested. Very briefly, I want to tell you about my background. My first college degree was in studio art, followed by undergraduate degrees in anthropology and biology, then a master's of environmental studies, and a PhD in sustainability and governance. And I'm telling you about this because I believe my interdisciplinary background defines my work. My work over the past 25 years has focused on plastic pollution and water policy. In the very recent years, on single-use plastics. This chart shows annual production of plastics worldwide from 1950 to 2023. And as you can see, that number has increased with each year. In the 1950s, global markets were producing about 5 million tons of plastic each year. And in more recent times, it's upward of 400 million tons every year. When you read documentation from the plastics industry online, they make it very clear that they would like this number to increase every year. And people say, well, that's fine. Why don't we just recycle? But what we know is that 95% of plastic packaging worldwide is not recycled, and 90.5% of all plastic ever made has never been recycled. Much of this material was not designed to be recycled. Plastics are a very useful material. That's why we find them everywhere, and many of us use them every day. But a lot of the qualities that can make them so useful can also make them a problem in the environment. And I'm going to talk about each of these issues with plastic individually. First, plastics can be a problem because they don't break down quickly. We actually don't know how long it will take many plastics to break down because it's not just a function of the type of plastic, how thick or thin it is, how soft or hard it is, but also the conditions in which that plastic is found after its useful life. So, a piece of plastic that's on the bottom of the ocean, on the floor of the ocean, that is not subjected to oxygen or sunlight or wind is going to break down much more slowly than a plastic on a shoreline that is subjected to those factors. Plastic is also a problem because of the harm it can cause wildlife. And one of the ways it harms wildlife is through ingestion. This is a photograph of the Laysan albatross, which nest on the Midway Islands, which are relatively near the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, one of the gyres in the ocean where plastic accumulates due to wind and ocean currents. So these birds hatch on the Midway Islands in a nesting area, and the adult birds go to look for food for them. But unfortunately, more often than not, they find material that's not edible. They feed it to their young, and those birds cannot evacuate the material from their system, and so it takes up room in their stomachs. So much so that there is not room for the calories, for the nutrition that would allow them to grow and put on muscle mass and eventually fledge. So instead, many of these birds die before fledging. Excuse me. The other problem that can happen with wildlife is that of entanglement. This is a photo that was shared by Helen Master of the Phillip Island Nature Parks in Victoria, Australia, of the Australian fur seal. And at this clinic where they work to rescue injured animals, she said when this seal came into the clinic, they first thought it had been hit by the propeller of a boat because of this gash along its shoulder. But in trying to rescue, they found actually what was at the bottom of that wound was this piece of twine or string. So a relatively small and lightweight piece of material caused injuries in this animal that it was not able to survive. They taxidermied the results to use it as a teaching tool. A lot of what we know about the way plastics can harm animals comes from a book chapter written in 1997 by the researcher David Laced. And at that time, he just brought together all the materials that had been published by other researchers, researchers who might be studying sharks or turtles or marine mammals or whales, and had mentioned in an offhand way or anecdotally that they had species with experiencing entanglement, ingestion, or both. And his article, his book chapter, really just makes a list of all those records and brings them all together in one place. At that time, they came to understand that more than 250 different species were had records of entanglement, ingestion, or both. Now, Professor Kuhn and her colleagues updated that research in 2015 and found the number had more than doubled to 557 species. It is important to make a note of two things. First, yes, there is more plastic or debris in the ocean between 1997 and 2015, but it's also true that this is an area that people began to research during this time period. And so, of course, when more people are looking for this evidence, more is found. And so the numbers also reflect that. Plastic debris also worsens the issue of invasive species. If you can imagine how far a piece of driftwood might float from one island chain to another, imagine how much farther a piece of plastic can float. And it's not that researchers are necessarily worried about large animals hitchhiking from one environment to another, but they have concerns about microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, these sorts of things being able to go to a new area and become an invasive species there, where their natural competition or predators would not be found. As you likely know, invasive species cost millions and millions of dollars each year. Plastics do break down, they just don't biodegrade. And so, as they break down, they create a toxic soup in our oceans. Researchers who study the gyres, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, can tell us that the number of plastics is increasing and the size of those plastics are decreasing. So they're more and more smaller and smaller pieces, which makes sense when you consider they're sort of churning around in these gyres over decades. It's also true that plastic debris costs money. It costs millions of dollars each year to clean up. And it is not the people who manufacture or profit from plastic who foot the bill. It is more often taxpayers and governments that are cleaning up plastics in their communities. It's also true that plastics worsen the issue of climate change at every stage in their life, from their extraction and transport to the refining and manufacture, in waste management, and in the environment when it's left there as litter. This is a photograph of an ethane cracker that just went online in the United States outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania last year. It's a $6 billion project that produces 1.6 million metric tons of plastic each year. They received big tax credits to build this plant, and it's a place where they're transforming fracked gas into plastics. So in America, when we had the debate about whether we were okay with fracking, I think many people imagine that this gas was being used to heat people's homes, not to produce plastics that then would be waste in the environment. So while the data we have about plastics and their accumulation in the environment can seem dire, this is an issue that researchers believe can be solved. And what researchers say is that to solve this problem, we have to look at the root causes. We need to think about how this problem can be different in different environments around the world. We need to consider human behavior, and that we can use this to educate and then create strong policy. So having read those researchers, I applied for funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2016 to investigate with my students what this problem might look like on Long Island Sound, which is the Connecticut coastline. We are not in an area where massive amounts of debris accumulate like they do on the Midway Islands. So we wanted to know what this big global problem looked like in our backyard. So the idea behind the grant is that I would work with my students to go and use scientific methods to collect debris. Then we would analyze what we found and share the results with policymakers. So, in just a few hours of collection in our local beach, we found over 1,600 individual pieces of debris. As you can see, it was overwhelmingly plastic. And when we analyzed it, we found that it was most um, accurately characterized as municipal waste. It was the kind of material you would see, on a regular basis. It wasn't from shipping or manufacturing or other sources. It was definitely from human waste. So we saw things like cigarette butts, food wrappers, plastic bottles, beauty items, this sort of thing. So, based on that research, I applied for funding from the Fulbright Foundation and was very fortunate to get the opportunity to live with my family in Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala for 6 months in 2019. And here are just some of the people I got to work with during that time. It was a really wonderful experience. But the idea behind the project was that I would replicate this project in Trivandrum, that we would collect debris and then analyze it and share the results with local policymakers. So one of our first excursions was to Manamkulam Beach, where we spent a few hours collecting debris. Just like in the United States, we found debris, and we found that it was overwhelmingly made of plastic, and that debris, when we analyzed it, was what we would call municipal waste. Based on that project, I applied for funding with a colleague at the University of Kerala to bring a group of educators and researchers from around India down to Kerala to take part in a workshop. And the idea behind this workshop is that we would train other researchers in the same method so that they could return to their communities and collect debris. And we were very fortunate to have Dr. Kakavipur come and be a part of that group. So one of our first collections was on the Karamana River. And in just a few hours, we found over 1,600 individual pieces of debris. It was overwhelmingly made of plastic, and just like in the previous collections, we would characterize it as municipal waste. Another group returned to Manamkulam Beach, and there again they found over 6,000 individual pieces of debris. 88% of what they found was plastic, and just as before, it was characterized as municipal waste. Several of the participants in that project were able to return to their home communities and collect debris there as well. That led to the cleanup of more than 33,000 individual pieces of debris. Plastic was always the most frequently found item in these collections. And working with other researchers from National Geographic, I applied for funding to replicate this project in Uganda. And the idea is that I would work with Hannington Ochieng, who's a Ugandan river ecologist, and a researcher from Indonesia named Puspita Kamil. And we would replicate this project on the Aturukuku River near Tororo, Uganda. So at this point, I've returned from my wonderful experience living in uh, Trivandrum for 6 months with my family. I've returned to my university, and I'm feeling a lot of momentum behind my work. I've got a grant with National Geographic. I'm about to do another one, and I'm feeling really excited about the progress I've made with my research. So it's the fall of 2019. And I thought to myself, I think 2020 is really going to be my year. I think I'm really going to accomplish great things in 2020. And I think you know what happened next. I did not accomplish great things in 2020, and it was not my year. And in fact, all of the research that I had planned to return to India, to go to Uganda, to go and do a workshop in Colombia in South America, all of that research was canceled. And as my family and all of us were working through the pandemic, I started thinking about the way we frame the problem of plastic pollution and the stories we tell about plastic pollution. It's very common in the research to see things like researchers will say things like, these are the 10 worst polluting countries in the world, or these are the 10 dirtiest rivers in the world. And many times they're always talking about the developing world. And oftentimes they're talking about areas in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Now, I have very little experience working in South Asia, but what I found is that the people in my community there bought the same things at the grocery store that my family and I bought and seem to live very much the same way. When I have waste in my household in the United States that is not recyclable, I put it in a bin by the street, and a truck comes and picks it up, and it disappears, and I never have to think about it again. But the truth is, at best, it's going to be incinerated or buried in a landfill. And I thought, my my community has not solved this problem at all. At all. We're just better at hiding the problem. And so, of course, that's not a long-term solution at all. And so I thought it makes sense to me to tell a more honest story about the way people like me contribute to this global problem. And that's much more honest than pointing a finger at people in other communities and saying their rivers are dirty or they are the worst polluting. We're all polluting. So I thought I could bring my artistic background to tell a different story. And I know that researchers talk about the ways that the arts can influence the way we think about things, the way we learn, the way we communicate, the way we build knowledge, the way we develop empathy. And so I started thinking about that book chapter from 1997 by the researcher David Laced, where he named the 250 plus species for which there were records of entanglement, ingestion, or both. Now, that seemed like a lot of species to cover, but within that list, there were these 46 species. These are the animals, the species for which at that time there were records of both entanglement and ingestion. So I thought they would be a good group to create portraits of. And I decided to just make portraits of all of these animals, life-size portraits, by sewing plastic onto canvas, the kind of plastic that is often marked as if it is recyclable when it is not recyclable anywhere in the United States. So some of those creatures are small birds, and some of those creatures are large whales. My process as an artist is to quickly sketch the animal on a piece of canvas. You can see some examples there. And then to sew by hand the plastic onto the canvas to create the portraits. And I'm going to go through several here so you can see the dimensions are listed at the bottom of the page. I have at this time created more than 50 of these portraits. They're all life size and they're all made from plastic that cannot be recycled in the United States. So at this point, it's still in the pandemic, about 2021 at this point, and things are beginning to open up again in my community. And so I thought it would be interesting to create some of the larger portraits with the public. And so I began to go to, this was the summer of 2021, to camps for children for the most part in the towns near where I live. And we first began working on the minke whale. And here you can see the minke whale, 18 feet by 7 feet in its completed form. And then we began working on the sperm whale. And you can see that. I held workshops for about 6 months where the public could come in and participate. And here's the final version, 60 feet by 20 feet. And you can see me next to it for scale. It hung at my university in front of a bank of windows, which gave it a very different look, more like stained glass, for about 6 months. And since that time, for about the past year, it has been at the regional airport near where I live, and it will be up until June of this year. There you can see it hanging at the airport. Then we began working on the final whale from this series, the bowhead whale. And you can see that coming together, and there's the final version of that portrait, and there I am on the bottom right-hand corner for scale. So I completed the portraits of the first 46 species, and then I started looking at the Kuhn article to see how many more species since that first research for which there are records of both entanglement and ingestion. And I've begun working on those 73 species as well. The smaller ones I make by myself, and the larger ones I make any whales, some large sharks I make with the public. So for me, I'm still very interested in merging art and science and using the arts to tell stories and to get people to think about environmental problems in new ways. And on that journey, as a National Geographic explorer, I was invited to take part in an expedition of a circumnavigation of Svalbard in the Arctic in June 2023. And my mission on this trip was to create a sketchbook of what I was seeing, mostly watercolors. And the idea was to especially pay attention to issues of climate change and plastic pollution. And I'll just quickly go through those images now. You can see them here. I was collecting stories and hearing people's information from people about what they had experienced, people with a lot of experience in that climate and in the Arctic, hearing about their stories about how things were changing and how climate change was affecting this area. Svalbard is a place where there are more polar bears than people, and yet any beach that we stopped on to hike, very isolated, no one living nearby, we would find plastic every time we stopped on the shorelines. It's deposited there by ocean currents, even though people do not live nearby. And we certainly saw wildlife interacting with plastic and plastic everywhere we went. We were able to circumnavigate Svalbard in June of 2023 only because the ice had melted so much that it made that possible at that time of year. I'm still trying to figure out how I will use these sort of for scientific analysis. I have found that there are records of other voyagers who have created artworks in the region. There's a website called watercolorworld.org, and it's a big global map with pinpoints around, and you can click on those pins and you can see watercolors that other voyagers have made of the same area where you are. So here's some of the watercolors made by people in the 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s of the same places that I visited during my travels around Svalbard. And I only saw these after the fact. I think it's very interesting that some of them are capturing some of the same things, the same scenes that I saw. But I'm not sure yet how I want to analyze the images from the past and compare them to my own to try to more deeply understand how this area is affected by, for example, climate change. So I try to end on a high note. I think when we think about big problems like climate change and plastic pollution, it can feel very overwhelming. But I want to encourage you that we can all do something to help this problem. We can all try to use fewer single-use plastics. And I don't want people to feel as if they need to be perfect. I think it's very difficult to be perfect because there's so many single-use plastics around us, but we can all try to do better. As someone who works in a political science department, I think it's very important that we communicate to our leaders what we think is important, especially around policies for plastic pollution and climate change. I also try to use and highlight companies that choose not to use plastics because I think that's such a commendable um, choice. And then there are definitely apps that anyone can use, like the Marine Debris Tracker app, that will allow you to collect data and build the global database of knowledge about the way litter moves through the world. Anyone can use that on a smartphone. So these are some of the organizations and institutions that have supported my work. And here is my contact information. And I would love to communicate and answer questions for you by email if you have any about my work. Thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this conference. Thank you.